So Paula Ison, that's who our final storyteller is. She's absolutely just amazing and beautiful woman. I love Paula so much, and she and I met at the first Cincy Stories. Chris Seelbach spoke, and he introduced us, and he was like, hey, you should have Paula. She has a great story. You should have Paula come out and speak. And I was like, okay, cool. And I knew nothing about Paula, and he didn't really give me any other details other than that. And so I was like, okay, and it was kind of like there in the back of my head, but it wasn't something that I was pursuing right away. And then I go to the Enquire's LGBT storytelling night, which was really awesome. They had so many really powerful stories being told, and I sat down, and I was there a little early, and I went by myself, and I was just like doodling on my phone, kind of like awkwardly sitting there not knowing anybody, and then Paula comes and sits pretty much right next to me. And so I was like, hey, Paula, and then she was like, hey, you. Didn't totally remember me as well as I remembered her, but we struck up a conversation, and I had remembered saying, like, hey, we would love to have you come speak at Cincy Stories, and then we started talking about public speaking, and she asked me if I did any public speaking, so I told her, and this isn't something that I go around telling people all the time, but I'm a pastor here in the city, and that's probably why Rome thought this was a church event, which it's not at all, so don't worry. We're not going to like take up an altar call at the end or take up an offering. But I am, and so I was like, yeah, I do some public speaking occasionally, and so we got to strike up this conversation where Paula started telling me sermons that she had known, and I was like, I would love to read some of those sometime, and she actually brought them today for me to read. So that was really sweet of Paula to do. But Paula is retired, which I'm sure she loves. She's an activist for transgender and LGBT rights here in the city, and I'm going to stop talking about Paula and let her talk about herself. So let's invite Paula Ison up to share her story.
For the record, I retired on May 22nd, 10 weeks ago. I'm really good at it, too. Well, good evening, Cincinnati. I'm Paula Ison, and I'm really excited to be here. When Sean told me I could speak for up to 15 minutes, my first reaction was no way, because for some of you, I'm the only thing standing between you and your next beer. So I'll move this along really quickly. I call myself the accidental Cincinnati, and that's because before I lived in Cincinnati, I lived in Jacksonville, Florida, working for a really small insurance company of only 40 employees. After being in Florida for just a couple of years, I had maxed out all my promotional opportunities, so I started to look around for a better job. I found a really exciting job in a trade magazine, and the only drawback I could see to that job was that it was in Chicago. Now, I didn't know anything about Chicago, but I knew the winters were brutal. I knew the traffic was brutal, and I thought the cost of living was pretty high too. But the job looked so good, I thought, well, I'll send my resume off, which I did. And a few days later, I get a phone call from the hiring employer, and they started in with a telephone interview of me. And about halfway through the interview, the guy on the other end says, oh, by the way, the job's not in Chicago, it's in Cincinnati. Is that okay? Well, I didn't know anything about Cincinnati either, but I knew the winters were warmer. I knew that traffic wasn't as bad, and I suspected the cost of living was a lot less. So I said to him, sure, Cincinnati sounds great, whatever. So the phone interview went really well, and at the very end, he asked me if I would fly up for a face-to-face interview. But he didn't want to meet me in Cincinnati. He wanted to meet me in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he had other business. So I flew up to Raleigh a week later, and we interviewed. The interview went really well, and I was offered a job, and I accepted. It was with Great American Insurance, just about 10 blocks over here, even though I had never, ever been to Cincinnati in my entire life. Now, I remember the job started on a Monday in mid-May, and I drove up from Florida on a Friday night, drove about halfway and stopped in Georgia, and then I continued on the next morning. And I pulled into Cincinnati Metropolitan at about 10 o'clock on a Saturday night in May. And I remember driving up I-75 northbound past the Florence Mall where they have the big water tower, Florence, y'all. I remember getting into the Fort Mitchell area knowing I was really close to Cincinnati. I was getting excited. And then I got to the Kyles Lane exit. And if you know that part of the road, after you pass the Kyles Lane exit, the interstate bends to the left, and then suddenly it bends to the right, and you're in the cut in the hill. And that big panoramic vista with all the lights at 10 o'clock at night opened up to me, and it was a total surprise. All the downtown city lights were lit up. The old Riverfront Stadium had a Reds game going. They might have even won that night. And I was just mesmerized. It was so beautiful. So I made my way down the hill, wandered over the Brent Spence Bridge, and wandered into downtown looking for my hotel. Well, I accidentally stumbled upon Fountain Square, and I didn't even know it existed. And there were a lot of people. The square was really busy that night from a lot of the people from the Reds game. And it turned out that there were a couple of junior, senior proms going on that night at the downtown hotels. And all the youth were out on the square getting their pictures taken in their prom attire. All the horse-drawn carriages were working and were lit up that night. And it was another beautiful scene to me that I accidentally stumbled upon. I can remember sitting at Vine and Fifth at a traffic light saying, "You're falling in love with Cincinnati, and you haven't even gotten out of the car yet." And 30 years later, I'm still in love with Cincinnati. Now, despite that grand entrance to Cincinnati, I have to tell you, I had my most embarrassing moment just 2 years later here in the city limits. And it's worth telling you the story so you don't make the same mistake I made. A friend of mine invited me to dinner, and I accepted. And they invited two of their friends to go. And I didn't know these two friends. These two friends were total strangers. So the four of us met up in Western Hills somewhere at a diner. I'm looking at the menu, and I saw that they had my favorite open-faced roast beef sandwich. I loved that sandwich, and I loved to bury it in gravy. So that's what I ordered. And the two strangers, coincidentally, ordered the same sandwich. So 3 of the 4 of us had the same order. The server brings us our food, and I took my first bite of the sandwich, and I instantly said, "Not enough gravy." Now, knowing that we had 3 of the same orders, I thought, well, surely the server has brought a bowl of gravy on the table. So I looked around for the bowl of gravy, and there it was, right next to me, to my right, between me and one of the stranger neighbors. So I took my spoon, and I ladled a heaping spoonful of gravy and dumped it onto my sandwich. And then I took a second ladle spoonful and dumped it onto my sandwich. And then I ladled up a third spoonful. And suddenly I realized that the conversation at the table had come to a complete stop. Everybody was staring at me, and one of the strangers says, "What on earth are you doing?" So I looked at my sandwich, I looked at my spoon, and I looked at the bowl of gravy. And for the first time, I realized that wasn't a bowl of gravy, but instead it was my neighbor's cup of coffee. And I'd accidentally ladled 2 spoonfuls of their coffee onto my sandwich. Now, realizing I had just made a terrible faux pas at the dinner table, I had to come up with some kind of alibi for why I did that. So I tried to explain away that their coffee was dark brown, and had there been a bowl of gravy there, it would have been dark brown too. And easily somebody could have got confused. Well, they would have no part of my alibi, and they just laughed at me for the next 2 hours. I like to remind myself that story periodically, just to remember not to take myself too seriously, and that you shouldn't take me too seriously either. Well, a couple of years later, I had what I think was the first of 2 defining moments that I think are worth sharing to you. In the mid-1990s, I was having a bit of a midlife crisis, and I got the bright idea that I should go back to night school and take some easy psychology classes so perhaps I could resolve my issues. So I took Intro to Psych, I took Abnormal Behavior, and I took Human Sexuality. And in the 4th class, I took Introduction to Women's Studies. And the professor was a wonderful woman named Dr. Nancy Taylor. And at the end of the last class of the last semester, she said to the entire class, "Where do you want to be in 5 years, and what's it going to take to get you there?" Well, over the next several weeks, I thought hard about her questions, to the point where I was pondering over her questions. And after a month of pondering, my final answers were, "I don't know, and I don't know." But I knew one thing. Wherever it was that I wanted to be, it would take a better education and better credentials. So I vowed then and there to quit taking the easy psychology classes and to take the harder ones. So I took personality theory, animal behavior. I even took the dreaded statistics classes, mandatory for all psychology majors. Along the way, I found myself surrounded by social workers taking the same harder classes. And this group of social work friends that I fell into started encouraging me to get a master's in social work program going. So after I had completed 15 psychology classes, which is pretty much a major, I applied for and was accepted to the University of Kentucky master's program in social work. I started in the fall of 2003 and I graduated in the spring of 2006. Well, thank you. And now I had that better education, those better credentials that I had vowed to go get. And what I found out right away, almost accidentally, was doors started opening to me. I started to get invited to other meetings, invited to other panels and speaking opportunities. The second defining moment occurred in the summer of 2000 when I had a chance meeting with a local businessman that you all know by reputation, but I probably never had the opportunity to meet. His name is Paige Buskin, and he owns the Buskin Bakery chain. I was chatting with Mr. Buskin, and he was asking me some easy questions, like where did you grow up, where did you go to school, and what do you do for a living? When suddenly, out of the blue, he says to me, although you have a good education already, I think you're capable of an even better education, and I encourage you to go get that better education. And then he added, although you've obviously got some talents that you've developed and you've been successful, I think you have more talents and you need to develop them. And then he used a really interesting choice of words. He said that some of my talents that he thought I had were buried so deep within me that I didn't even perceive that I had these talents. Well, I started thinking hard about that, and I thought, you got all that out of me in just 3 questions? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was telling me one thing. I was middle-aged when I was listening to him, and he was telling me that old dogs can and should learn new tricks. The other thing I thought about on retrospection was I had unwittingly been saying no to too many opportunities. I was telling people, no, I'm not interested in that. No, I don't have the time for that. So I changed my philosophy and started saying yes. Yes, I'll make time for that. Yes, that really does sound interesting. And more doors opened up. And he was right. I did have some unperceived talents buried deep within me. And I don't want to bore you with all the details, but the last 15 years since that encounter with Mr. Buskin, it's been a sweet ride. It's been exciting, and I'm looking forward to my next 15 years. So I need to ask you and you and you and you and you and all you people out there I can't see, where do you want to be in the next 5 years? What's it going to take you to get there? And I have to challenge you, like Mr. Buskin challenged me, to look deep within yourself and find those unperceived talents that are buried so far down below that they need to rise to the surface to make Cincinnati an even better city than it already is. Now I'm about done. I hope that I've been of some value to you. And if you think I've been a waste of your time, just remember that I tried to forewarn you when I told you I didn't know the difference between gravy and coffee. Thank you.